It's essential that there are enough red blood cells to carry the oxygen from the lungs to the tissues of the body. And these red blood cells must contain the oxygen-carrying pigment hemoglobin. So the red blood cells and the hemoglobin must be present and must be intact to transport the oxygen. Now the next thing we need is that there needs to be patent arterial vessels. So here we see an arterial branch, and as we've looked at before in other videos, arterial branches divide and typically supply a wedge-shaped area of tissue with their blood supply. So these areas of tissue here are supplied with blood from these arterial branches. So there's a larger artery dividing into smaller arteries which perfuse areas of tissue. The blood must be circulating, and the blood must be able to perfuse through patent vessels to carry the red blood cells which carry the oxygen to the tissues. So as well as having viable red blood cells and a viable blood supply, the blood vessels must be patent and the blood must be circulating through the tissues of the body. There must be adequate perfusion. Now finally, in the tissues we also have capillaries, of course. So here's a blood capillary in the tissues of the body. It could be anywhere. It could be in the liver, could be in your foot, could be in the brain, could be anywhere. And here we have the red blood cells carrying the oxygen. And then surrounding the capillary we have the tissue cells. Here we have a group of similar cells comprising a tissue. So next it is necessary for the oxygen to go from the red cells to the cells of the tissue. And this will only happen because the cells are bathed in tissue fluid. This tissue fluid is formed from the plasma, and it bathes all of the cells in the body. They're all bathed in tissue fluid. And this is the essential diffusional medium through which oxygen must travel from the red cells. So what's actually happening is oxygen is diffusing through the endothelial walls of the capillary into the tissue fluid, and from the tissue fluid it is diffusing on into the individual cells. And then in the individual cells we have the mitochondria, these sausage-shaped organelles, highly enfolded in a membrane. And here the enzymes which facilitate the process of cellular respiration reside. So once the oxygen has entered the individual cells, the oxygen diffuses through the cytosol of the cell into the mitochondria, where the oxygen is actually used. This is where it needs to get to. The whole purpose of all the physiology we've looked at so far is to get oxygen to the mitochondria. And here, glucose can be combined with the oxygen. But of course this can only happen if the oxygen gets there to produce energy, plus waste carbon dioxide, plus water. So I've called this process the oxygen chain. So we started off with molecules of oxygen in the atmosphere up here. These had to pass through patent airways, patent bronchial trees, to get into the lungs. This can only happen if there's a functional chest wall and diaphragmatic muscle. That depends on the nervous innervation of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. The lungs must be functional and patent. The air must be able to get in and out of the alveoli. Oxygen must be able to diffuse from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. This is the next part of the oxygen chain. It must be able to get from the alveoli through into the blood. The red blood cells must be of sufficiently good quality and sufficient numbers to transport the required amount of oxygen. The blood vessels must be patent so that the oxygenated red blood cells are effectively carried into the tissues, carrying the oxygen with them. Once in the capillaries in the tissues, the oxygen must diffuse from the red cells into the tissue fluid, into the cells themselves. Finally, the oxygen must diffuse into the mitochondria, and of course the mitochondria must be able to use the oxygen. Healthy mitochondria can use the oxygen. Finally, the essential oxygen has got to the mitochondria, and in this example, glucose plus oxygen is giving the life-giving energy to power all physiological processes, plus waste carbon dioxide and water. So the whole purpose of this oxygen chain is to get the oxygen to the mitochondria. And I think you can see that if the oxygen chain is broken at any one point, if there's no oxygen in the air, or these are blocked off, or these aren't working, or the lungs aren't healthy, or the oxygen is not diffusing across, or the tissues aren't carrying it, or the oxygen is not getting to the cells, or the mitochondria can't use the oxygen. If the chain is blocked at any one of these points, or if the chain is reduced at any one of these points, then there will be hypoxia. There will be a deficiency of oxygen at the level of the tissue cells. This oxygen chain must be intact or hypoxia will ensue.